This session is all about the crisis, how it has impacted different regions, how those regions have responded, and what we have learned from that. One of the truly striking things about the crisis, in sharp contrast even to what we thought a year ago, is how varied the impacts and the responses have been. At one of the breakout groups this morning, we looked at the impact on South Asia, for example. Very, very different responses and different impacts. Pakistan compared to Bangladesh, for example. Sri Lanka compared to India. Even at the sectoral level, compare garments, for example. Cambodia, highly dependent on garment exports, massively hit by the crisis. Bangladesh, dependent upon garment exports, actually its garment export industry is not majorly affected. Why is that? Last week I was in China, and one certainly didn't get the impression there that this was the worst crisis in 80 years and going to deeply threaten them. In the 4 days I was there, it was announced that China had emerged as the #1 exporter in the world and the #1 purchaser of cars. I spent half a day at a 100% Chinese privately owned company. Didn't exist in 1989, now has assets of 4 billion, sales of 3 billion, producing the largest photovoltaic sheets in the world, and investing heavily in research on carbon capture and use, not carbon capture and storage. Ask them about the crisis, they will say, what crisis? We are still moving forward. Go to other countries, you get a radically different view. I hope that we can have some link with the discussions that we've had earlier in the conference. At this morning's plenary session, we had a fascinating discussion as to whether or not crises lead to lessons and changed practice. On the one hand, we had Professor Daniel Daianu from Romania, who said this crisis has changed everything in terms of understanding what is necessary to get real development. That as a result of this crisis, intellectual battles have been won and lost, and behavior and policies will be different as a result. We then heard Professor James Robinson from Harvard, who said, actually, I've looked at crises over the last 100 years, and quite frankly, they do not lead to changed behavior. Why? Because policies depend upon power, not on intellectual progress, and only if that power changes will you see change practice. So I'm hoping that our panelists, in addition to giving us some insights as to how countries have been affected, how regions have been affected, and what the response has been, might capture a little bit of that intellectual agenda. We have 5 very distinguished panelists, so we're going to be very tight on the time. We have our system at the front. They're allowed 15 minutes maximally, and they will have the sound turned off after that. No, they won't, but we will be fairly tough. I'll introduce the first one now, and it's a great honor to have Ernest Aiti here. He's a senior fellow and director of the Africa Growth Initiative at Brookings Institution. He's also the director of the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research at the University of Ghana. He's lectured all over the place at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, at Yale University, at Cornell, at Swarthmore, and so on. He's well known for his work on informal finance and microfinance, but he's written 3 books, 32 journal articles on a whole range of subjects, and it's a great honor to have you here, Ernest. It's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. In this presentation, I'm going to focus much more on the story that reforms do pay. My takeoff point, basically, is that African countries over the last 2 decades have seen varied reforms across them. And there are countries that pursue reforms much more vigorously than others, and those countries that took reforms much more seriously have seen a lesser impact of the crisis on their economies and their people than others. In this presentation, I'll discuss briefly the impact on the economies, and then I'll look at how African governments have responded, taking 4 countries for illustration. I'll talk about Ghana, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia for reasons that will be obvious. And then I'll dwell a bit on the lessons and the future challenges from these. The first point I make is that the crisis occurred at a time that many African countries were beginning to come out of the earlier difficulties that they had been in. Everybody has known Africa for being a slow-growing part of the world for many, many years. And in the last decade, prior to the reforms, prior to the crisis, many of these were beginning to come out of that for 2 reasons. One, linked to the commodity price boom. And then the other, not often mentioned, but quite true, is the improvement in policy environment in many of these countries. So we saw well-managed economies that were beginning to do well, recording growth rates well over 5% in a number of them. Average, we give here about 5% for that period, 2000 to 2009. To 2008, inflation declining in many countries. In my own country, we've seen, we've become used to inflation well over 30% for many, many years. For the first time, we had inflation is around 10 to 12%. There were countries in Africa that were experiencing single-digit inflation for well over 5 years and so on. It was also a period where we began to see more private capital flowing into these economies. So that for the first time, in 2007, private capital flowing into Africa was much more than aid coming into the region. So things were beginning to turn around for many of these countries. One of the points we also make was that despite the fact that they were beginning to do well, they did not have enough time to develop robust institutions and structures that would sustain the growth that they were experiencing. So what it meant was that many of them were so vulnerable to shocks, and what the results I will be showing clearly suggest this vulnerability that many of them have been through. Apart from the financial crisis, we all know quite well, before that we had the food crisis that affected many countries in Africa, as indeed in many other developing countries, and also the energy crisis that came shortly before the crisis of the financial sector. So clearly, this last crisis came when these countries had barely come out of some of the initial challenges that they were facing from the food and then the energy problems. The reflection of that difficulty was probably amplified in some countries much more so than in others. In a country like Ghana, in 2008, we had a fiscal deficit of 14.9% of GDP, quite huge. If you compare that to the situation prior to 2008, where macro performance had been quite impressive, clearly there were these difficulties. Now, in all the countries throughout the region, the impacts varied. There were some that were very, very severely hit, and others not so. The extent or the severity of the crisis in those countries and how it affected households, for example, or small businesses, depended to a very large extent on what kind of institutions they had. So where, for example, the financial system was much less so involved with the global financial system, there were very little flows between these economies, and that didn't then show on the credit side. In other places like South Africa, where we had a much more intense relationship, this was much more visible than in the other places.